as so my first book is called Sparrows and Sparrows. It came out 8 years ago now, and it chronicles childhood abuse and a young adult speaker coming to terms with that trauma and how it plays out in her relationships with family, with partners. And as Ben mentioned, my next book, Bianca, comes out next year, and it'll be 9 years between books. And during that time, I became a mom. I also had the privilege of getting a lot of mental health help. And so I was diagnosed with complex PTSD and bipolar 2 disorder, which I talk about a little bit more in my newer poems. And I've also learned a lot about how mental illness has affected my family members. And it, in a lot of ways, gives me a lot more perspective, I guess, on the narratives that I tell in the first book. And now there are many more complicated layers. And I typically, like lately, like to read poems about a lot of that thread, like the mental illness thread, the family thread, the parenthood thread. But I've been thinking a lot about relationships, and I think I've been thinking of the virtual space sort of as a time capsule, right? Like, who knows if virtual readings will happen for however long after the pandemic ends, after, right? Like, I mean, I hope the pandemic will end. And so, you know, what does it mean for an individual reading to be a time capsule of that period? And I wasn't gonna read this poem, but I think I will now. So I think I'll just read like a few poems from the book and then end with a long poem from my forthcoming book. And Ben said that in California, it's not as cold as it should be, which I'm right now in Brooklyn, New York, and we're expecting a huge snowstorm. It's like one of those storms where everyone's on their seats kind of checking the weather every day, because depending on how the wind blows, we're either gonna get 2 inches or 15 inches, and we're not gonna know until Saturday. And so I thought I remembered this poem that I have in this book about a blizzard. One time I was on my way, I don't remember where anymore, it was somewhere overseas, and I was on a plane and it had taxied away from JFK Airport, and then the blizzard hit. And I was stuck on that plane for 10 hours, just like on the tarmac. And then after that, they drove back to the airport and just said, you guys need to find new flights. And so that was my worst flight experience. So this is a poem that contains that, but you know, isn't necessarily about that. This malfunctioning wing. While the man sprayed antifreeze to de-ice one wing, the other wing froze over. I unbuckled. I watched the man steer his cherry picker to the other wing. Then the first wing froze over. After the 5th intercom apology, the attendants served cold cinnamon rolls while we sat for 10 hours, stuck too far from the airport to walk back in the blizzard. Once we taxied to the gate, I phoned a man I had pretended not to love, even after his skull fractured and his brain sponged enough blood to mop over his motor skills. Neurologist said he should have died. Maybe he'd taken enough bats and bottles to the body for God to hand him a consolation miracle. Captain Ice Chips, ears bleeding, he whispered. His first attempt with a telephone after his, what did he call it? Fight, accident, triumph. I abandoned him the following July to fall in love with a man who had never broken a bone, but almost died in combat gear, jumping from an Army aircraft. We made love while I fingered 2 childhood scars embossed in his back from reaching beneath the jagged bottoms of fence slats to save a dying bird. My mouth has endured 2 kinds of men, the men who save and the men who are dying birds. I am neither savior nor prey, but a plane, the one they jump from, the one that almost kills, the one they can't board post-accident because their brains rattle, the one that carries unforgiving people pressing buttons, asking for ginger ale, the one that waits, frozen, for a man to de-ice this malfunctioning wing, then the other, the one that wants to scourge the runway to fly, but instead wheels back to where she came from, lets all her passengers go. Speaking of airplanes and airports, I was talking to a friend the other day about how in high school I would just drive to the airport. My town had a small airport, had a free parking lot, and I would just park there. And I think it was my way of running away without running away. And it wasn't until after that conversation that I remember I had a poem that had a little bit of that in it. So, sex and horseradish. My mother left my father more than once, a favorite family tradition observed when I was 4, 10, 11, 12. Leaving is easier the second time. Like sex, distance is an acquired taste, horseradish. When I first touched a boy, I lusted for that stench of begging. I would trap the boy in his car, demand he drive to the airport and park. He would reach between my jeans. I would cry, beg for no reason. Then he'd also beg, and I'd let him drive back to his large house. Let him see his married parents again. I left that boy, then left the next one, then left the next and the next. And when one tried to leave me, I tied that one to my neck. He stayed for years until I left him too. Flew away, really. His body hanging from my body. So what I also really like about this space and thinking of it as a time capsule and as like a one-off event that is hopefully unique from other virtual events is that I get to read poems that I don't typically read. And so this next poem, I don't think I've ever read at a reading, which is unfortunate because it was kind of fun to read it. It's a breakup poem, and I should read it more often, but I don't know, maybe you guys think I shouldn't, who knows? You can tell me later. But so the only thing you really need to know is that once when I was in my 20s and manic, I decided to visit my friend who lived in Jinja, Uganda for 2 weeks. And I convinced her that we should go whitewater rafting on the Nile River. And I can't swim, or I couldn't swim then. I still cannot really. And when we went whitewater rafting, I went overboard a little, like the raft, I guess, went overboard, and I was in the river twice, or I fell into the river twice. And so that's all you kind of need to know. And also that this is a breakup poem. The untold version. I tell everyone the rapids dumped me into the Nile, but in the video, I appear to let go of the raft, the oar. I dive into the river. In the dream, I unbuckle the life vest, scrape off the helmet. I don't hold my breath, I gulp. In the nightmare, the Nile becomes the stream kicking down your cheeks. In your delusion, I am the woman who controls the dam. I take a hammer to the metal, hack everything loose. You believe I'm both the villain and the damsel. In my story, you are scenery. You serve as backdrop to each character climbing into my blouse. No, you are the stain on that blouse. You weren't the one yelling swim in real life. In real life, I opened my eyes underwater, stretched for light. I pictured you holding me down. I pictured me drowning by choking on you. And I'll end with a long poem. Victor. And I'll end with a long poem that's in my forthcoming book, Bianca, in the spirit of I guess there was a relationship theme. So this poem is called My Whole Life I Was Trained to Deny Myself. So I mean, it's long, but I hope that's not terrifying. It's more like a lot of tiny little stories in a long poem. So hopefully you can stay awake. My whole life, I was trained to deny myself. My whole life, I was trained to deny myself to please my father, who'd make me tiptoe from wall to wall, then back again to improve my lacking calves, or worm the ground like a vacuum, palming the carpet for bits of trash he'd count in my little hands. When I spilled a cupful of crushed chili flakes on my chapaghetti noodles, he forced the whole hot bowl down my throat as I sobbed, and he ordered my hair pulled back, always in a ponytail. It wasn't until I neared 40 that I discovered them, the women I twisted myself into for the men I loved, all slumped in my gut like a heap of secondhand costumes. Once, I followed a man into a hurricane minutes before it stripped half of Manhattan from power. I trailed behind him when the transformer line exploded and the night sky flashed a ghastly green like God smothering the city with a neon sheet. Then the traffic lights, street lights, and every last lamp through every window flickered, then snapped, and in that alarming darkness, the city shrank into a closet so cramped I couldn't breathe. Still, I stood in that downpour on a 6-story roof to hold up his boom mic as he recorded the storm. For another, I became a Ron Paul for President groupie. I scanned Reddit in my homemade campaign shirt while smoking weed to white boy emo tracks about Tommy guns and existentialism the same year I voted for Obama. For yet another, I learned to ride a bike, even managed one from the village to the GW bridge, but when the path clogged halfway up with bikers on 3 sides of me, close enough to kiss, I forgot how to brake. I threw out my hands to grab the highway divider and collapsed. Then I hauled up the rental to finish the trek, bloody knuckles and knees be damned. And for hundreds of mornings, I woke each morning before the morning, not even 2 hours after last call in the city, to blend spinach and strawberries with flaxseed meal and hemp seeds for a man to take to work. And when one provoked a drunk stranger, then couldn't meet a deadline with his battered head, I let him turn me into a comic book android. I wrote pages upon pages of a monologue he fed to the robot, fashioned by a toy maker who loved her the way he thought he loved me. He injected her with scene after scene from my childhood, and in the final issue, haunted by my life, she screams, "Stop inventing me," before she claws open her chest and yanks out a fat blue gem carved like a heart. And during a spell, when I was shackled to no man, I got naked in a room full of naked people, all of us drunk and stoned, seated in a circle like school children, waiting for some game to begin or for the morning hello song, the kind that loops until you've hollered everybody's name. At daylight, I drove the prettiest of the girls home, the one some men bragged they could bed with a fat stack of C notes, the one who eventually married the mayor's son. She had a habit of laughing at everything everyone said and danced with her hands above her head like someone panicking with a pistol pointed at her face. For years leading up to that day, I thought she was the sort of woman I was supposed to be, non-threatening, with a body that inspired valuation. She insisted she ride with me instead of with the boys hovering over her like a flight of hungry kestrels. And minutes into the drive, it became clear she wanted something from me, something like, absolution, approval maybe. And she said, I feel sad. And she said, I don't know who that was. I don't know why I did that. That thing, what we'd all done all throughout the night. And I admit I was rankled by her conscience clanging louder than mine, which was bored of my neglect by then and resigned to watching my life lurch forward without it. When my father wasn't sculpting or smacking me, he said I was made in the image of God. So God I became, forging myself each time I found a man to die for. I was the creator, the crucified, the wildfire slamming against their chests. I read what they read, and I drank what they mixed. I bent the way they bent me to do what they invented, and how I charmed their brothers, how I disarmed their mothers, the lemony dolmas, the pink pork meatballs I rolled with them, the dough I pinch pulled, then dunked in anchovy broth. And when I married the last man I loved, as the woman I thought I was, I woke one night like a djinn, horrified to find herself fixed in her final incarnation. I stopped recognizing myself to such a degree that some days I'd wake having forgotten. Really, I'd forget we had an actual child. I morphed into a serpent, a tempest. I struck myself against our domestic walls like a mad bat trapped in a coop. And my husband, who from the beginning looked at me like he understood I was not his, like he was willing to take what he could get for as long as I let him have it, refused to enter my war. How bereft I was, left with no enemies. How I brawled on that battleground alone with myself, punching at nothing until I conjured my multitudes. I wish I could say I freed myself somehow, that I'd pried those shadow selves from me with a hex, a needle, a healing quartz, or that like the cloak of Bartimaeus, they dropped in the dust when I stripped myself to sprint toward the Savior's voice. No. By then, I'd lost that appetite for discarding myself. I carried them one by one, like bride after bride across the threshold and removed their boots. I drew baths loaded with salts, cooked meals in butter. I let each one sleep when she needed to sleep. And in time, I thanked them. I came to recognize their service. And in time, they let me love them the way a father or a mother ought to have loved them. Yes, I suppose I do mean me.